Robb Stark knelt in the godwood of Riverrun, breathing in the damp scent of old wood and flowing water. Here, beneath the weirwood's red leaves and solemn face, was where he thought best, where he felt the presence of his ancestors and the quiet hush of the old gods. Dawn had barely broken, yet he had not slept at all. By his side, gray wind paced, rustling fallen leaves and growling softly at something only the dire wolf could sense. It was quiet enough that Robb could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Catelyn was inside, resting fitfully, and the rest of the castle had not begun to stir. All that existed for this moment were Robb, the trees, and the choices that pulled him in a dozen directions like over-tightened reins. He ran a hand through his auburn curls, feeling the sting of old regrets. He was young to bear the weight of a crown and a kingdom's hopes upon his shoulders, too young, perhaps, to carry such a burden without faltering. He was determined, though, that he would not falter. The North expected so much of him. The lords and ladies who had rallied to his call proclaimed him king in the North, a title that made his heart swell with pride and dread in equal measure. He could not afford to yield to sorrow or anger, no matter how keenly he felt them. His sister Sansa was a prisoner in King's Landing, or so the Raven said, and Arya's fate was even more uncertain. Bran and Rickon were back in Winterfell, too young to grasp the shape of the war that had consumed the Seven Kingdoms. His father's death still haunted him every night, that memory of horror entwined with outrage, the injustice swirling around his every waking thought. Yet he had pressed on. He had led his men to victories in the field, capturing Jaime Lannister and winning the respect of the Riverlords. But the cost weighed on him every day, the men he had lost, the friends he had buried, and the alliances he had strained or broken. He thought of the promise he had made to wed one of Walder Frey's daughters in exchange for crossing the Twins. And he thought of the promise he had shattered when he gave his heart and name to Talisa Mager, that bright laughter in a field hospital who captured his affections in a single heartbeat. He knew full well how grievously the old Lord Walder had taken the slight. Even now, rumors spread like plague that the Freys whispered treason behind their locked gates, that they schemed to betray him to the Lannisters or to slip a knife between his ribs when he stood unguarded. The Freys were powerful, cunning, and legion in number. He had risked their loyalty by his impulsive marriage, a betrayal of custom and agreement. Now fate offered him another chance. If he was wise, if he made amends, he might bring the Freys back into the fold and ensure safe passage through the Riverlands. In some corner of his heart, he still grieved for Talisa, whose life had been cut short by complications of a wound not long after they were wed. Every time he breathed, he remembered how her eyes had grown dim in a candlelit chamber, how her trembling hand had brushed his cheek before slipping away. The old gods had granted him a fleeting happiness only to snatch it away. Mourning her had nearly broken him, but it also offered a strange route for redemption. He was free now, though that very idea carried guilt. Free to make good on a vow he had spurned. He closed his eyes and touched his brow against the cool bark of the weirwood, silently beseeching the old gods for guidance. The sigh of wind through branches answered. The weirwood's carved face stared without blinking, its tears of red sap glistening like fresh blood. Robb felt an odd calm settle over him. If he would be the king in the North, he must be more than a skilled battlefield commander. He must become a statesman and a peacemaker. The Freys demanded his presence and his penitence. He would give them both, if only to spare his army another enemy at their backs and possibly spare the realm another cycle of violence. Lord Walder had summoned him to the Twins to negotiate a new arrangement. A marriage. Another Frey bride. The old man wanted to see that the rightful king in the North had not forgotten his word. He rose slowly, shaking off the numbness in his knees. Grey Wind stepped close, nuzzling Robb's hand. The direwolf's presence steadied him even further, reminding him of his own identity and that of his house. Starks loved deeply and felt pain keenly. They also endured. "Come," he whispered, stroking the great wolf's ears. "There's much to be done." He turned from the silent weirwood, footsteps echoing through damp leaves. Tomorrow, he and his mother and a retinue of lords, knights, and foot soldiers loyal to him would depart for the Twins. He would meet Walder Frey on that precarious ground again, and he would see whether peace or treachery awaited him. They set out at dawn. The baggage train stretched longer than Robb's eye could measure, wagons laden with supplies, weapons, and small luxuries intended as conciliatory gifts for Lord Walder. The northern banners flew in the breeze, House Manderly's Merman, House Umber's Giant, the flayed man of House Bolton, the fearsome Blackfish of House Blackwood, and countless others. In the center, the largest of them all, soared the gray direwolf of House Stark on its field of white. Men marched in disciplined columns, wearing colors that had grown ragged from so many months of war. Though their boots drummed against the road, their spirits were subdued, anxious. They all knew the stories of Lord Walder's temper and the tenuous nature of this parley. Robb rode at the head beside his mother, Lady Catelyn. She wore her grief on her face. Grief for her husband, her absent daughters, and for the countless tragedies befalling the realm. Yet she maintained the composure befitting the Lady of Winterfell, her auburn hair braided neatly, her gray-blue eyes scanning every turn of the road for potential threats. She was his chief advisor and the person whose counsel he trusted above all others, even if they sometimes disagreed. By her side rode the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, whose sharp gaze and sharper tongue had never once failed to bring a dose of practical sense to any situation. "You know what we ride to?" Catelyn said, her voice low enough that only Robb and the Blackfish could hear. "Walder Frey is cunning, fickle. He knows you need him more than he needs you. He'll press that advantage." "I know." Robb kept his eyes on the winding road ahead. "We cross the Twins, or we remain penned here in the Riverlands, vulnerable to the Lannisters. We can't afford for Walder Frey to turn cloak." Brynden snorted. "He's not the only crossing in the Seven Kingdoms. But it's the best," Robb replied. "And the crossing I need now. He might not be the loyalist ally, but I can't lead half my host wandering across the width of the Trident looking for a new route. We'd lose men to hunger, exhaustion, desertion, and Tywin Lannister would seize on that weakness the moment he could." Catelyn's gaze softened. "You plan to accept his daughter's hand again?" Robb swallowed. He was reminded of Talisa's warm smile and gentle wit. He felt the pang of loss as though it were a fresh wound. "Yes," he said. "Lord Walder will demand it, I have no doubt. He wants his house tied to mine by marriage. I don't have a choice, mother. This is the surest way to keep our cause strong. Just be certain," she said gently, "that this is a bond you can live with, that you treat the girl kindly." "Always," Robb said, and turned his face forward so she would not see the guilt in his eyes. When they reached the Twins after days of careful marching, Lord Walder's men greeted them with a perfunctory salute. The massive towers rose on either side of the Green Fork, an imposing fortress that bridged the water, flanked by high walls and dotted with arrow slits. Freymen in pale gray livery stood watch, pikes in hand. Robb remembered the last time he had come here, how tense it had been even then. The memory of that uneasy meeting with Walder Frey, the old man's rheumy eyes flicking over Robb in appraisal, came back to him in full. They were shown into the main hall with minimal ceremony, though at least they were allowed within. Robb, his mother, and a handful of highborn lords, including Lord Roose Bolton, Great John Umber, and Edmure Tully, made their way through crowds of Freys who gathered to stare. Women with pinched expressions and men with proud or sly faces. There were so many Freys, and each seemed intent on marking Robb as though they were measuring whether he truly was the king in the north or merely a foolish boy who had broken a vow. Lord Walder awaited them on his high seat at the far end of the hall. Even from the distance, Robb could smell the stale odor of the man, reminiscent of old linens left out too long in the sun. Surrounded by a gaggle of his children, grandchildren, and various relations, Walder Frey peered at Robb's party with an undisguised sneer. The hush in the hall was almost tangible. One could hear the clink of armor, the shift of boots on stone, and the rustle of dresses as the Frey women craned for a better look at the king in the north. Robb halted a few paces away and knelt as was required, though he felt a hot flush of shame prickle his neck at having to bow to the man. "Lord Walder," he said, voice strong enough to carry. "I come before you to seek your forgiveness and to do what I must to honor my house's word." Walder Frey let silence linger uncomfortably before responding. Then he coughed, an old man's wheeze that caused several of his kin to rush forward as if to pat his back. He waved them away. "So, the young wolf comes, tail between his legs." His voice cracked with mockery. "You think the Twins so easy to cross? You think old Walder so eager to forget a broken vow? I recall what you did, boy. Don't think I've forgotten. My precious crossing is quite valuable, and I see no reason to let liars pass freely." Robb kept his composure, though he could feel his anger rising. "Your crossing is of immense importance, my lord. That's why I come before you to beg your pardon. I once made a vow to wed one of your daughters. Circumstance," he hesitated, searching for words that would not offend. "Circumstance led me astray, and my new marriage was short-lived. Yet I will uphold my earlier promise if you permit it." Lord Walder's watery eyes flickered with a cunning glint. "Will you now? So quick to trot to the Frey dais and pick a bride to seal our little agreement?" He cackled. Well, I've had my daughters and granddaughters paraded before you once already, and you turned your nose up, you did. Might be I don't care to see such a parade again. Maybe I'll close my gates and call the Lannisters for better terms. They're rich, you know. Robb swallowed the insult. And if you did, my lord, you'd have no alliance with the king in the north when this war ends. Walder Frey tapped bony fingers against the arm of his seat. Alliance? Do I look like a fool that I'd trust your alliances after you've broken one betrothal already? Another series of harsh coughs rattled in his chest. Yet, if you're earnest about it, perhaps I see a slight advantage in wedding the king in the north to a Frey. Keeps all the blood nice and tidy, doesn't it? As for that forgiveness you're seeking, well, I might grant it. But you'll have to grovel a bit more. Catelyn's face turned stony, but she said nothing. The entire hall seemed to bristle at Walder's impertinence. Robb felt his blood simmer. Yet he could not let pride rule him here. Name your terms, Lord Walder, Robb said, straightening from his kneeling position but keeping his tone respectful. I came here to make peace, not war. Walder Frey squinted. First, you wed my granddaughter, Rosalind. Pretty little thing, that one, gentle and proper. You'll not find better among my brood. She's betrothed to Edmure Tully, but I expect you to outrank him as a suitor. Your uncle can pick another. He coughed again. Second, I want restitution for the slight done to my house. I want certain honors, titles, possibly even Harrenhal. I hear it's vacant enough, and I fancy the look of those melted towers. Well, we can talk details. Third, I want an apology. A public one. And I want you to kiss my hand and call me your lord and friend. Do that, and maybe I'll let you cross. It was an outrageous demand, but Robb had prepared himself for much worse. He glanced at Catelyn, whose jaw was set firm with anger. Edmure seemed ready to explode, face reddening at the casual disposal of his own betrothal. The Blackfish placed a hand on Edmure's shoulder, keeping him in check. Robb drew a measured breath, recalling that he had come to do what was necessary for the sake of his people. He thought of the north frozen fields and snow-capped forests, Winterfell's grey walls, the stone bridge at White Harbor, the lonely moors of the Dreadfort. All those who looked to him to shield them from Lannister retribution. For them, he would swallow any pride. He bowed his head. Very well, he said, voice carrying through the hush. I, Robb Stark, king in the north, will marry your granddaughter Rosalind Frey. I grant you an apology for my transgressions against your house. Lord Walder, I call you my friend, and I humbly ask your forgiveness. I will cross the twins under your safe passage and do what I can to secure Harrenhal or comparable lands for your house when the war is won. Our alliance will be sealed in marriage, and I will see to it that my uncle Edmure Tully is compensated for the broken betrothal. A sly grin twitched across Walder Frey's wrinkled lips. Good, he said. That's a start, at least. He extended a quivering hand. Robb approached and, before a hall of silent onlookers, pressed his lips to the old man's knuckles. The taste of stale sweat and dust lingered on Robb's mouth, along with the sharp tang of humiliation. But he reminded himself of the price of the war, of the men's lives that balanced on his next decision. When he pulled back, Lord Walder's grin had widened to reveal a scattering of yellowed teeth. Rise, your grace, he said, and mockery laced the words. Welcome to the twins. We'll celebrate this new arrangement, and then we'll see to how we can help each other in these trying times. And so Robb Stark swallowed his pride in that grand hall and began the slow turning of a tide that might just save his cause and put an end to the war. They stayed at the twins for several days, finalizing the details. Rosalind Frey was indeed a soft-spoken girl, with wide brown eyes and trembling hands that seemed frightened even by her own reflection. Robb took pains to show her kindness whenever they were ushered together for inspection by Walder Frey. He sensed in her a deep apprehension. She was kind to him in her quiet way, offering a small smile whenever they spoke, but there was a sorrow there too. Robb wondered what dreams she had harbored of her marriage to Edmure Tully, who, despite his flaws, had at least been raised in a culture more amenable to the Tully-Frey match. Now, everything was scrambled for the sake of strategy. Edmure sulked, but he did not defy his nephew. He understood enough about the precariousness of their position to avoid open conflict with Walder Frey. The old man seemed to take perverse delight in dangling other Frey daughters before Edmure, remarking upon each one's virtues or lack thereof, until Edmure was forced to choose. In the end, Edmure settled upon a quiet, plain-faced Frey named Eleanor who had a softer countenance and fewer illusions of romance than Rosalind. The wedding date for Robb and Rosalind was set a fortnight from their arrival, to give Walder Frey time to gather lords, ladies, and as many Frey kin as possible for the grand occasion. Robb's bannermen looked uneasy, with the memory of his first broken vow fresh in mind, but they accepted that the North needed Frey loyalty. As the day drew near, the twins bustled. Servants carried in casks of wine and mead, storehouses were emptied to feed the massive crowd, and Lord Walder's brood arrived by the wagon load. There were Freys of every age. Bald old men, timid maidens, stout knights with sullen faces, and plump-lipped children who scampered underfoot. Some muttered that so many Freys in one place could only bring trouble, but Walder seemed determined to put on a grand spectacle. He wanted the realm to see the Freys as indispensable allied with the king in the north. For his part, Robb avoided direct confrontation and instead busied himself by talking with Roose Bolton, the Great John, and the Blackfish about the next steps in the war, ensuring that their plans aligned with the new alliance. Catelyn spent hours with Rosalind, guiding her on what would be expected as the new queen in the north. She taught her about the northern houses, about Winterfell, about the duties of a Stark wife. Rosalind listened attentively but seldom spoke, as though overshadowed by the weight of her new fate. Occasionally, Robb would see them together in a courtyard or corridor, his mother's arm protectively around the younger woman. Each time, Rosalind's eyes darted away and she offered a feeble curtsy. Robb tried to reassure her, once attempting to take her hand. "I know this must feel strange," he told her softly, "but I vow to honor you. I will not break this vow." She nodded, eyes shining with unshed tears. "My lord, my king," she searched for words and then settled for a trembling smile. "I am grateful for your kindness." The wedding day arrived beneath a pale sky streaked with clouds. It felt as though the gods themselves were uncertain what to make of this union. The ceremony took place in a small sept that Walder Frey had built for his seventh wife, a cramped and damp place that nonetheless had space enough for the wedding party. Candle flames flickered in the draught as the officiant, a septon imported from some lesser branch of the faith, droned through the wedding rites. Rosalind was dressed in silver gray embroidered with white dire wolves, a token to honor House Stark. She looked, for all the world, like a child bride, though she was of age enough. Her hands trembled, and her face was hidden beneath a translucent veil. Robb wore a doublet of dark gray wool trimmed in black fur, the dire wolf sigil stitched on his breast. He repeated the vows with as much sincerity as he could muster, his voice echoing in the hush, to take Rosalind Frey as his wife and queen, to keep her in sickness and in health, to cherish and guard her. When Rosalind spoke, her voice was soft, but it resonated in the stillness. Catelyn stood behind her son, watchful and solemn. Lord Walder hovered at the periphery, a smug smile etched into his gaunt face. Freys were jammed into every available space, some leaning against walls, others craning from the doorway, to witness the union that would elevate their house to an even greater station. At the end, when Robb gently lifted the veil and kissed Rosalind, her lips felt cold. Yet her eyes turned up to his with a shy hope, as if maybe all was not lost. The sept erupted into applause, some more genuine than others, and so King in the North and Frey bride were joined. The feast began at sunset in the great hall. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pork, venison, goose, and swan, along with savory stews, bowls of vegetables, and loaves of bread. Lord Walder sat at the high table with Robb and Rosalind, along with Catelyn and Brynden Tully, Edmure and his new bride, and a smattering of Walder's favored brood. Musicians plucked lutes and hammered dulcimers. The air was thick with the smell of ale and spilled gravy. If there was tension behind smiles, it remained unspoken. Walder Frey toasted the new couple with a mocking flourish, and Robb answered in kind, though more politely. Rosalind mostly stared at her plate, nibbling cautiously. After the last of the sweet pies had been served and many of the guests had begun slumping with drink, Walder Frey stood, tapping a bony finger against his cup to draw attention. "A toast to my new good son," he announced. "May his sword stay sharp, may his bed be warm, and may his sense of honor be more steadfast than a summer snow." A chorus of laughter came from his kin, and some from Robb's men forced a polite chuckle. Now, the old man continued, "I believe we have some business to discuss about crossing the river. Since all is forgiven, I trust you'll be wanting to muster your armies soon to continue your war." Robb glanced at Catelyn, then stood as well. He was braced for the next volley of demands from Walder. "Yes, my lord. Now that we are joined by marriage and your friendship has been renewed, I wish to lead my men south again to face the Lannisters." If you'll permit us the crossing at first light, we can begin. Walder tapped a hand against the table. So quick to return to your war. We only just got you married. More laughter. But yes, yes, cross you shall. I'll open the gates for you. And as for that matter of lands, Harrenhal is something you'll need to win by the sword, but if you do, I expect you to keep your word, or we'll have more ill will than before. Robb swallowed. I will honor our agreement in full. The phrase shall hold Harrenhal if it's mine to grant. Walder inclined his head, smug and satisfied. Then we are at peace, O king. But don't forget, if you fail, well, I'll be forced to reevaluate who my friends are. Such is the nature of old Walder's dealings. Robb's mouth tightened, but he nodded politely and lifted his cup. May it never come to that. To House Frey, our hosts. The Northman echoed his toast, and the phrase answered. For the first time, Robb felt a measure of genuine relief rising in him like a slow tide. A fragile alliance had been forged, an uneasy bond that might hold if fate and the gods were kind. That night, he and Rosalind were shown to a bedchamber decorated with threadbare tapestries and a musty old bed that smelled faintly of dust and moths. Robb was not heartless. He could see how frightened she was, how her entire body trembled. She reminded him of a fawn separated from its mother. He tried to ease her nerves with gentle words, and they talked for a long while, perched on the edge of the bed. She spoke haltingly of her childhood, overshadowed by so many siblings, never sure if she would be traded off to some distant lord to further her grandfather's ambitions. Robb confessed a few memories of his own youth at Winterfell, of playing in the snow with his siblings, of how proud he'd been to be the son of a man as honorable as Ned Stark. Rosalind's eyes shimmered, and she reached out to touch his hand. When at last they settled under the covers, Robb made no move to claim the marriage's more carnal rights, not that night. Instead, he held her carefully, letting the hush of the chamber envelop them. For a long time, she listened to his steady breathing as she drifted to sleep. In that moment, Robb realized that perhaps they could find a measure of genuine companionship even if it was built upon the ashes of old betrayals and heartbreak. Come morning, Robb prepared to move his forces across the twins. The alliance with House Frey proved functional if not warm. Walder Frey stood upon the ramparts watching as the northern host marched past. Pennants waved, horse hooves clopped on the stone causeway, and wagons rumbled in steady columns. Robb rode at the head, Rosalind at his side for a short while before she dropped back to one of the wagons carrying the ladies. Catelyn was near the front with Brynden Tully, scanning for any sign of treachery, but no arrows flew from the walls. Walder Frey might be cunning, but he had decided to honor this arrangement for now. Once the entire host had crossed into the southern side of the river, Robb ordered them to make camp and begin preparations for the next stage of the campaign. Scouts were sent out to gauge Lannister positions, supply lines were checked, and alliances with other riverlords needed tending. The knowledge that House Frey was no longer a dagger at his back gave Robb a fresh sense of confidence. He only hoped that it was not a false security. In the weeks that followed, word spread the king in the north had made amends with House Frey, had taken Rosalind Frey as his queen, and was marching south to resume the war against the Lannisters. The realm buzzed with speculation. Some jested that Robb Stark was collecting wives like a hedge knight collects fleas, while others deemed it a prudent move, a sign that the young wolf was more than a glorified boy general. The smallfolk who suffered the ravages of war cared less about which high-born lady he had married than whether his forces would protect them from marauders and bandits who roamed unchecked. Rosalind adapted to her new role slowly. She spent her days within the safety of Robb's encampments, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, some of them Freys, others from the north. She found herself in the company of Lady Catelyn often. Catelyn treated her kindly, if a bit distantly, as though she wasn't quite certain what to make of this new daughter-in-law. Rosalind was timid but eager to learn, and she found genuine friendship with Daisy Mormont, whose blunt honesty provided a stark contrast to the anxious courtesies of the Frey women. For his part, Robb discovered unexpected solace in Rosalind's presence. She had a gentle way about her that soothed some of his war weariness. She listened to his worries and offered a soft word or simple gesture that reminded him of home. Though his feelings for Talisa remained like a ghost in his heart, he began to see Rosalind for who she was, not as a mere political tool or a frightened child. They talked long into the nights about the north, about the freckled face of Arya that Robb missed, about the final words of his father before everything fell apart. She did not judge his grief, only held his hand as he expressed it. Over time, he found himself grateful for her presence, for her unassuming warmth. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister had not been idle. He gathered his hosts and planned to crush the Stark forces once and for all. News came by Raven that King Joffrey had died unexpectedly. A scandalous rumor circulated that he had been poisoned at his own wedding feast. The Iron Throne was in chaos, with Tommen Lannister a mere child king, and the power behind him uncertain. The Tyrells maneuvered for influence, while the Lannisters struggled to maintain control. Tywin himself was rumored to be furious, determined to end all threats to his family's rule. Yet with the North and the Riverlands united, and now with the Frey secured, Robb's position looked stronger than ever. Robb's spies reported that Tywin was marching an army northward, seeking a confrontation near the Red Fork or perhaps in the plains west of Harrenhal. Rather than wait idly, Robb conferred with his bannermen. "We meet him on chosen ground," he declared. "Somewhere we can exploit our cavalry and the terrain. The Freys have their men, but I don't trust them wholeheartedly. We'll keep them on a flank with strong northern oversight, so that no sudden betrayal can catch us unawares." Roose Bolton, quiet and pale, offered a thin smile. "Should we consider sending envoys, my king? A show of willingness to negotiate? If Tywin sees a united front, perhaps he might consider terms." Robb shook his head. "I doubt Tywin Lannister wants peace. Not after we took Jaime. Not while he believes he can snuff out my claim. No, we must be ready for battle, but we'll offer negotiations if only to buy time to gauge his next moves." And so letters were exchanged, posturing as always in the grand game. Tywin's reply was succinct. He demanded Stark surrender, the dissolution of the king in the North title, and the immediate release of Jaime Lannister. Robb read it in silence, then calmly burned the letter. War, then, was inevitable. For weeks, armies maneuvered across the Riverlands. Robb took Riverrun, using it as a base of operations. The Frey contingent, led by Ser Ryman Frey, arrived at Riverrun to coordinate with the main Stark host, though they were met with distrust by the River Lords. Lord Walder himself remained at the Twins. Rosalind wrote letters to her grandfather entreating him to honor the alliance, while Lord Walder responded in short, curt missives that made it clear his loyalty went only so far as Robb's successes. Finally, news came that Tywin Lannister's army was on the march for a full confrontation near the God's Eye. Robb gathered his forces, Northmen, Riverlords, a scattering of Freys, and led them south to meet the threat. Along the way, peasants fled in droves, carrying their meager possessions, some entreating Robb to protect them from Lannister soldiers rumored to be pillaging outlying villages. Robb tried to keep discipline among his men, ordering no wanton destruction, punishing thieves in his ranks. He understood that part of winning the realm was winning the hearts of its people. As the two armies drew closer, negotiations resumed. Tywin's envoys rode forth, clad in Lannister red, bearing a white banner. They demanded the return of Jaime Lannister before any discussion of a truce. In exchange, they hinted that Tywin might allow the North a measure of self-governance. Robb, however, sensed that such offers were hollow. Jaime was too valuable a hostage. If he gave up Jaime, the Lannisters would have little incentive to bargain. Instead, Robb proposed a swap. Jaime for Sansa and Arya if they still lived. The envoys demurred and departed. Days passed in tense waiting as the armies camped near each other. Even in the midst of these preparations, Rosalind Frey found moments to slip into Robb's command tent or join him for a quiet meal. They did not share the fiery passion he had known with Talisa, but a gentle warmth had grown between them. She felt safer in his presence. He felt calmer in hers. The battle erupted at dawn one misty morning near a broad expanse of farmland. Robb woke to the sounds of horns blaring on the perimeter. The Lannisters had moved under cover of darkness to attempt a surprise attack on the Stark cavalry. Yet Robb's sentries were well placed and the alarm spread quickly. He scrambled into his armor, a swirl of gray plate etched with the direwolf, and mounted his warhorse. Grey Wind bounded alongside him, snarling, eyes gleaming in the half-light. Trumpets and drums thundered across the field, men rushed to form ranks, and banners unfurled in the dawn wind. The lines clashed in an eruption of steel and screams. Robb led his vanguard, cutting through Lannister footmen, swords slick with blood, while Great John Umber roared his war cry and carved a path through the heart of the enemy. The Frey contingent advanced on the right flank, overshadowed by Bolton men who kept a watchful eye. Arrows rained from the sky, lodging in flesh and earth alike. Tywin Lannister himself commanded the opposing side with his typical ice-cold composure. His plan was to break the Stark lines early, sow confusion, and encircle Robb's main host. But the Northmen had studied his tactics, and each time a Lannister force pressed a flank, Robb's cavalry circled around to hammer them from behind. The ground turned slick with mud and blood. The rising sun illuminated a landscape of horror and heroism alike. At the height of the fray, Grey Wind leapt upon a heavily armored knight who bore the golden lion on his surcoat. The direwolf's jaws tore through metal and mail, leaving the knight's screams echoing across the field. Robb, pushing forward, caught sight of Tywin Lannister's personal banner, 2 golden lions on a crimson field, and spurred his horse in that direction, determined to end this war once and for all. Yet Tywin's guard was thick, encasing the Lord of Casterly Rock like an iron shell. Robb found himself locked in battle with knights and men-at-arms forced to fend off their strikes. Nearby, the Grey Chun was bellowing for the king in the north. His men rallied around him. Catelyn and Rosalind remained behind in the command tent, safe from the worst of the carnage, though fear for Robb must have been pounding in their chests with every passing moment. The fight wore on until midday, the bright sun reflecting off steel and turning sweat to steam on men's faces. Eventually, the tide began to turn in Robb's favor. The Lannister lines buckled under repeated cavalry charges, and his outriders cut off their retreat. Tywin, stoic even in defeat, signaled the horns to sound a withdrawal. Yet the Northmen pressed, capturing or slaying those who fell behind. Jaime Lannister was not present, but more than enough highborn knights ended up in Stark hands to serve as bargaining chips. When at last Tywin's battered army managed to regroup, they broke away under cover from their archers and retreated, leaving Robb in command of the field. Exhausted, stained with blood and grime, Robb rode back through the chaos to find Bolton's men still holding the Frey contingent in line, though some Freys had died. He wondered if any had attempted to switch sides mid-battle, but no, it seemed Walder's brood had kept their vow for now. Perhaps Walder had calculated that the Lannisters were losing their grip and guessed that standing with Robb might be more lucrative in the end. In the aftermath, wagons full of wounded men moaned and bled upon rough straw. Robb set up triage tents, had his maesters and healers tend not only to his own men but even to the enemy wounded who had been left behind. Victory tasted bittersweet in his mouth. So many had died. He did his best to walk among the wounded, offering words of comfort or a steady hand on a shoulder. He came upon a group of Frey men kneeling around the body of one of their own, a young boy no more than 15. Robb paused, sorrow twisting his heart. He knelt with them, placed his hand upon the boy's cooling brow, and murmured a silent prayer. He did not miss the looks of surprise. Perhaps they had expected their new king to pass by without a thought. But he would not. Though it pained him, these were the costs of war, and they belonged to him as much as to anyone. Word of Robb's mercy spread among the men, his willingness to allow even Lannister wounded a chance to be treated rather than simply left to rot on the field. When Rosalind heard, she quietly thanked him that night. She said it was good for a king to show such compassion. He clasped her hand and said nothing, remembering his father's lessons about honor and mercy and how it was far easier to commit to them in thought than in practice. The defeat near the God's Eye forced Tywin Lannister to retreat toward Harrenhal, the ancient ruin that served as a strategic stronghold. Sensing an opportunity to press his advantage, Robb led his army in pursuit. Scouts reported that Harrenhal was poorly supplied, that Tywin was struggling to keep his men fed. If Robb could encircle the fortress and cut off supply lines, the Lannisters might be forced to surrender or attempt a desperate breakout. Catelyn advised caution, warning that Harrenhal was rife with hidden passages and that Tywin Lannister would not lay down his sword easily. Robb agreed, so he laid siege carefully, building fortifications around the crumbling towers, establishing watch posts and supply routes from the river. Every day he inspected the lines, ensuring that no infiltration could break his hold. The weeks of siege dragged on, with small skirmishes erupting whenever Tywin's men tried to sally forth or foragers attempted to slip out at night. Through it all, Rosalind remained at Riverrun for her safety, along with many of the highborn ladies and lords. She wrote letters to Robb daily, short notes that told him of her longing, of the daily routines at Riverrun, of how the Tully and Frey lords occasionally clashed in small ways. Reading her letters brought him a sense of peace, a reminder that life existed beyond the war. In return, he sent her updates, sometimes terse, given his exhaustion, but always with a word of affection for his wife. At last, the tension broke when Tywin, desperate, attempted a midnight breakout, hoping to crush one segment of Robb's lines and escape. The alarm was raised by a vigilant guard, and Robb's forces scrambled to respond. The fighting in the dark was chaotic, torches bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps through the blackness, swords clanging amid shouted orders. Yet Robb's men held firm and Tywin's charge was repelled. Cornered, the Lannisters retreated back behind Harrenhal's melted walls. That failed attempt spelled doom for Tywin. His men's morale plummeted and their supplies were nearly gone. A parley was requested by none other than the Lord of Casterly Rock himself. Robb agreed to meet outside Harrenhal's gate at dawn with a minimal retinue. The contrast was stark. Robb in his grey armor, flanked by northern bannermen, and Tywin in battered plate, eyes haggard from weeks of fruitless siege. His golden hair had thinned to near whiteness. Yet he still stood proud as any lord. King in the north, Tywin greeted with cold civility. Lord Tywin, Robb replied in the same tone. You wish to parley? Tywin's jaw tightened. It seems we have no choice but to consider terms. And so they spoke. The exchange was formal, each side probing the other's weaknesses, seeking advantage. In the end, Tywin agreed to capitulate under conditions. His men would be allowed safe passage south, back to the Crownlands, and Jaime would be returned in exchange for Sansa Stark and Arya Stark if Arya was indeed in Lannister custody. Tywin claimed ignorance of Arya's whereabouts, but promised he would do all in his power to locate her. Additionally, the Lannisters would recognize the North's independence as a temporary measure pending a Grand Council. Robb, in turn, would refrain from pressing further into the Westerlands. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was enough to end the bloodshed between them, at least for the moment. Robb accepted, mindful of how precarious alliances and promises could be. In the days that followed, the Lannister host marched out of Harrenhal, weapons sheathed, scowling in defeat. Robb's men jeered them, but under orders, no harm was done to those who surrendered. The war, for now, had reached a stalemate. Tywin's agreement to a Grand Council was significant. It left open the possibility of the North's autonomy, or at least a negotiated settlement that might end the War of the Five Kings. With the main Lannister army gone from the Riverlands, the realm saw a glimmer of hope for peace. Robb released ravens proclaiming an armistice. He invited lords from across the Seven Kingdoms to gather at Riverrun, where he intended to hold a summit. Many responded, some out of a genuine desire for peace, others out of curiosity or self-interest. The Tyrells remained aloof, dealing with the political chaos in King's Landing. Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be licking wounds at Dragonstone, still proclaiming himself the rightful king but unable to muster enough force to make it so. A new swirl of rumor said that White Walkers stirred beyond the wall, but few in the south took such tales seriously. As the lords and ladies began to arrive at Riverrun, Robb returned there with his bannermen. A hush of anticipation settled over the castle. Rosalind waited in the courtyard with Catelyn. When Robb dismounted, helmet tucked under his AR. She rushed forward and embraced him tightly as if she had feared he would never return. He could feel how her hands trembled even now. He held her close, inhaling the faint scent of lavender in her hair. He murmured a greeting in her ear, smiling despite his weariness. In the days leading up to the summit, Robb could scarcely find a moment's rest. He supervised the welcome of the various lords, some from the Vale, some from the Crownlands, a few even from the Reach, though the Tyrell presence was minimal. The Freys, of course, attended in large numbers, though Lord Walder himself chose to remain at the Twins. Instead, he sent an envoy of his sons. They strutted about the corridors, eager to flaunt their newfound status. In the Grand Hall of Riverrun, a gathering occurred that would shape the future of the realm. Robb sat at the head of the dais, Catelyn by his side, Rosalind on his other side, quiet but attentive. Lords from across Westeros packed the hall, each with their own agenda. Edmure Tully, the new Lord of Riverrun, served as host, while Brynden the Blackfish looked on sternly from the sidelines. Representatives of the Iron Throne arrived, albeit with fewer men, acknowledging the shift in power. They carried terms from the Regency Council of King Tommen, effectively Tywin's voice, though Tywin himself had chosen to remain in the Crownlands to manage the aftermath of his defeat. A hush fell when the proceedings began. Robb rose and addressed the assembly. My lords and ladies, we have fought a terrible war, one that has ravaged the realm from the Neck to the Stormlands. Today we gather to seek a path to peace. I claim the title king in the north by the acclamation of my people, yet I do not seek endless conflict with the Iron Throne. Let us see if we can find a way to end this bloodshed, secure the safety of our families, and ensure justice is done for the wrongs that have been committed. He spoke with the practiced calm he had cultivated over the months. Men listened, some grudgingly, others with relief. Envoys from King Tommen read their piece, acknowledging the North's self-rule for a span of 5 years, after which a great council would decide if the North might remain separate or be reabsorbed into the Seven Kingdoms. The river lords demanded a voice in this arrangement, and after much debate, it was decided that the Riverlands would align with the north for that same period, bridging the two regions under Robb's protection. The Vale's presence was limited. Lady Lisa Arryn had not come, sending only a minor representative who mostly observed. The result was an uneasy pact, yet it was the framework for a fragile peace. In the weeks that followed, more negotiations took place in smaller councils. Rosalind quietly observed some of these, learning more about statecraft than she ever expected. She marveled at how Robb balanced deference and authority, never bullying lords into submission but also never ceding crucial points that would diminish the North's strength. Whenever disagreements threatened to erupt into violence, particularly from some of the more belligerent river lords, Catelyn's voice and Bryndon's scowl often restored order. Eventually, a formal document was drafted, containing the details of the armistice. It required that the crown renounce any immediate claims of taxation or fealty from the North and the Riverlands, demanded that both parties release hostages, including Sansa, who was finally escorted back to Robb in an emotional reunion, though Arya's whereabouts remained uncertain, and recognized that at the end of 5 years, a Grand Council would be convened to decide if the Union would be restored or remain dissolved. This was not the independence the North had dreamed of in full, but it was a respite, a chance to rebuild and regain strength. With the war's main fires cooling, armies dispersed, and men returned to their holds. Winter was coming, after all, and the people needed time to harvest and fortify against the cold. For House Frey, the pact bestowed recognition and the promise of Harrenhal, though that monstrous castle would need a new castellan and considerable investment to be useful. Some wondered if Walder Frey had bitten off more than he could chew. Yet the old man seemed content, for now, so long as his family's station rose higher than before. Roslind's presence at Robb's side, along with the broader acceptance of the Freys as allies, helped soothe the tensions that might have flared otherwise. Bit by bit, she forged relationships with northern ladies and river lords, bridging cultural gaps with her gentle courtesy. In her own quiet way, she was building the trust that her grandfather's slippery nature had undermined. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. Robb returned to Winterfell to find it damaged, courtesy of the Ironborn's earlier depredations but still standing in part. He set about the massive task of rebuilding, calling upon loyal lords to contribute manpower and supplies. He walked the old halls, ghosts of memory at every turn. He paused at the spot in the courtyard where he once sparred with Jon Snow, recalled the gentle laughter of Arya, the proud encouragement of his father. Rosalind accompanied him, wide-eyed at the sight of the Stark stronghold. She confessed she had never seen anything so large and ancient. She was startled by the cold that lingered even though winter had not fully descended yet. But she persevered, donning thick furs and learning the old traditions. The northern small folk, at first suspicious of a Frey queen, soon warmed to her kindness, especially when she visited the poor, brought them bread and blankets, and listened to their hardships. Catelyn traveled as well, dividing her time between Riverrun and Winterfell, trying to hold together what was left of her scattered family. Sansa's return brought both tears and a glimmer of joy, though the girl was changed by her experiences in King's Landing. She spoke quietly of the horrors she'd witnessed, the scorn she'd suffered. Yet she also carried stories of Tyrion Lannister treating her with relative kindness, and she remained hopeful that Arya might still be out there somewhere. Robb listened to her recount everything, wishing he could have rescued her sooner, but grateful that she was safe at last. Little by little, the scars of war began to heal. Northern villages took on new life as men rebuilt roofs, hammered new fences, and prepared for the approaching winter. A flow of trade resumed along the King's Road. Peace, an uneasy, tenuous thing, had settled over the realm. Tywin Lannister remained a looming threat, but for the moment he abided by the treaty, perhaps believing that time was on his side. The realm's focus shifted to the next Grand Council, still 5 years away, but creeping closer every day. Amid these changes, Robb and Roslind's marriage took on a deeper intimacy. Long nights in Winterfell's crypts or quiet corners of the godwood found them speaking in hushed tones about their hopes. Rosalind began to dream of children, telling Robb how she'd like a house filled with laughter. Robb smiled, though part of him worried about bringing new life into a realm still so fragile. Yet the thought of fatherhood also gave him hope, a chance to start anew, to pass on the legacy of House Stark without the shadow of war. When word reached them that Rosalind was with child, a hush of joy spread among the northern court. Catelyn embraced her daughter-in-law, tears in her eyes, no doubt remembering her own first pregnancy. The lords of the north offered congratulations to their king. Even Walder Frey dispatched a raven proclaiming his glee, though one could only imagine the calculations spinning in his conniving head. It was a moment of unity, however fleeting, that helped mend old rifts. Still, challenges persisted. With every passing moon, rumors of wildling incursions beyond the wall and ominous stirrings in the far north filtered south. Men spoke of white shadows stalking the winter wastes. The Night's Watch ravens begged for more men, more supplies. Robb received those messages grimly, recalling how his father had once told him that the true threats lie beyond the realm of petty politics. Though the immediate war with the Lannisters had stilled, a far greater danger might loom in the darkness. Rebuilding the north and fortifying the wall became twin priorities for Robb. He sent what aid he could to Castle Black, wishing Jon Snow were there to rally the Black brothers. But Jon was gone, vanished into the wild with the Watch. Robb could only pray that his half-brother, no, his brother, truly was safe. In time, a message arrived from King's Landing. Tywin Lannister was dead, slain by his own son, so the rumors said. The realm was in uproar once more. Tommen was a child, the Tyrells vied for control, and the Lannisters threatened to fracture from within. Some in the north looked south again, sensing an opportunity for further expansion or to press their advantage. Yet Robb resisted, remembering the cost of war. The north was still healing. Let the south devour itself if it wished. He had a kingdom to protect, a family to guard, and the threat of winter to outlast. He received ravens from the Freys, from the Boltons, from others in the Riverlands, each with conflicting advice. Lord Roose Bolton, ever the quiet opportunist, suggested a renewed campaign in the Westerlands to secure more territory before the Lannisters could reorganize. Walder Frey, in a rare moment of caution, urged Robb to wait, to see how the chaos unfolded. The River Lords, battered by war, pleaded for peace. Ultimately, Robb decided. He would stand firm. Let the south unravel. The north and Riverlands needed to fortify. Some of his men grumbled, hungry for spoils, but most respected his decision. They remembered the price in blood that had already been paid. Robb took counsel with Catelyn, who agreed that a stable realm would serve them better than more conquests. Her main worry was Sansa's future and the continued mystery of Arya. But there was little they could do beyond setting watchers on every road, hoping for a whisper of her whereabouts. As winter crept in, snows began to blanket the north. Wolves howled in the distance. Fires burned steadily in Winterfell's great hearth, and Roslin's belly grew heavy with child. She walked the halls slowly, leaning on Robb's arm when the weight became too much. She confided in him that she feared childbirth, having seen so many women suffer or die. Robb held her close, murmuring reassurances. He was frightened too, but he hid it beneath a layer of calm. The maester at Winterfell was skilled, he told her. The old gods would watch over them. At last, in the still, dark heart of winter, Roslin went into labor. A cruel storm raged outside, wind howling across the courtyards, snow piling against the windows. Candles flickered in her chamber as the maester and a gaggle of midwives busied themselves around her. Robb paced outside, his heart pounding harder than any battlefield had ever made it. He prayed to the old gods, to the new, to any power that would listen, that his queen would not be taken from him as Talisa had been. Hours passed like slow centuries. He heard Roslin's cries of agony, once, twice, a dozen times. Lady Catelyn emerged, her face tense with worry, urging him to be strong. Another hour, another. Then finally a wail pierced the hush, an infant's cry, lusty and full. Robb rushed in, seeing Roslin exhausted but alive, hair matted to her forehead with sweat, tears streaking her cheeks. In her arms lay a tiny boy, fists waving angrily at the cold air. Robb sank to his knees beside the bed, tears brimming in his eyes as he gently touched his son's cheek. The child quieted at his father's warmth, peering up with wide eyes that seemed to reflect both Roslin's gentleness and something of the Stark intensity. Roslin managed a weary smile, her voice hoarse. "He's here," she whispered. Robb leaned forward and kissed his wife's brow. "He's here," he echoed, relief crashing over him like a tidal wave. As he cradled his son in his arms for the first time, he felt a profound awe. This small life, born of a union meant to quell war, now carried the future of House Stark. In the days that followed, the news spread through the north and the Riverlands. A son was born to Robb Stark and Roslin Frey. The line of Stark continued, offering a fresh beacon of hope. At the same time, rumors from the south suggested the Lannisters had turned on each other, that Cersei Lannister teetered on the edge of madness, that the Tyrells were consolidating power around King Tommen. And from the far north, bleak reports of more wildlings crossing the wall and roving bands of undead horrors. The realm, it seemed, was not yet free of trials. But in Winterfell's great hall, as Robb Stark held his infant son, surrounded by loyal lords and a wife who had become dear to him, he felt a stirring of optimism. He recalled how close he had come to losing everything through a broken vow, and how forging a new alliance with House Frey had paved a path to this moment. He could still picture that day at the Twins, kneeling before Walder Frey, swallowing pride for the sake of peace. He remembered the tension, the old man's sneer, the hush in that hall. And he remembered Rosalind, trembling and uncertain yet willing to walk forward with him. Their union had spared countless lives. It was not a perfect union, but it had forged something stronger than either had imagined, a chance at enduring peace, an end to the War of the Five Kings. The realm would struggle on, with new enemies rising, but in the meantime the North and the Riverlands stood united, and a child's cry echoed with promise. A hush settled in the chamber as men and women raised cups in salute, offering blessings to the newborn prince. The great direwolf banner swayed gently in the torchlight. "To peace," the voices said, one after another. "To peace," repeated Robb, kissing the downy head of his son, feeling the beat of the infant's heart against his own. He prayed silently that the boy would grow up in a realm far different from the one Robb had known, a realm not torn by endless battles, but guided by alliances, forgiveness, and the bond that had begun at the Twins. And perhaps, through that forgiveness, the North would find its true strength, forged in the fires of war but tempered by mercy, leading them all into a future that Ned Stark would have been proud to behold. Robb Stark found it strange how quickly his life had changed and settled into something resembling a peaceful routine. The war, while never truly forgotten, had receded into a grim tapestry of memory, battles fought in the mud, men screaming their last, the nights spent planning around campfires, the terror in his mother's eyes whenever she feared for him. Now there was calm in the North, an uneasy, tenuous calm, to be sure, but a calm that permitted him nights of unbroken sleep more often than not. Instead of fur-lined armor at his bedside, he kept an infant's swaddling cloths. Instead of the war cries of the great John, he heard the soft, uncertain lullabies Rosalind tried to hum. Winterfell's halls had begun to fill again with new life. Blacksmiths hammered at forges in the yard, churning out horseshoes and nails instead of swords. Carpenters measured beams to replace rotted sections of the ramparts and to build new structures. Small folk huddled within the walls, having come from outlying farms that were too vulnerable to bandits or the bitter snows that threatened. The Stark banners still flew from every tower, though many had been singed or slashed during the war and had needed mending. Servants bustled around the great keep, seeing to the needs of the growing household. Sometimes Robb paused in a corridor, listening to the distant drone of voices, feeling the weight of the kingdom on his shoulders. Being king in the North was not merely a title to impress bards, it was a mantle that demanded decisions. Every morning, a fresh cluster of problems and pleas landed on his table, requests for grain, for justice, for building supplies, for more men at the wall. He faced them all with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through battle, yet it was a different kind of campaign, one that demanded patience, empathy, and a willingness to compromise. The child he and Rosalind had named Eddard in honor of Robb's father, Ned Stark, became a symbol of promise to the people. In the eyes of the North, that baby boy, red-faced and bawling as he was, embodied a future free of Southern entanglements and Lannister cruelty. His birth had sealed the renewed bonds between House Stark and House Frey, two families once on the brink of lethal betrayal. Each day, Rosalind ventured out into the Bailey or the Godwood, carrying Eddard in a swaddling sling. She'd pause to greet guards and small folk, letting them glimpse the small face of the future. Robb watched sometimes from an upper window, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He knew how fearfully timid Rosalind had been when they first married, how overshadowed she had felt by the ghosts of his old love and by the burdens of rule. Yet motherhood revealed a core of quiet strength in her, a willingness to adapt and learn for the good of her child and for the kingdom she served as its queen. Catelyn Stark had, in the meantime, become a rallying force in the tasks of reconstruction. She worked with the castle steward, with local clans, and even with the Manderleys from White Harbor to coordinate shipments of grain and salt fish to feed the swelling population at Winterfell. Her presence reminded many of Ned Stark's fairness and generosity, and so lords and small folk alike found comfort in her guidance. She wrote frequent letters to Riverrun as well, checking on Edmure Tully's progress. He was forging alliances with other river lords, maintaining the tenuous peace with the crown, and ensuring that Walder Frey's brood did not overstep. But the tenuous nature of that alliance still concerned her. Old Walder was as slippery as an eel in a barrel of oil. Even though his granddaughter sat beside the king in the north, the old lord would not hesitate to shift his loyalties if it benefited him. Catelyn often voiced these doubts, a note of worry creeping into her otherwise diplomatic words. "I've no illusions about Lord Walder's faithfulness," Robb told her in his solar one late afternoon as the sky darkened into a violet dusk. "But I believe Roslin's presence here and our child give him pause. He would not lightly betray his own blood's future." Catelyn was silent for a moment, folding her hands in her lap, her face in half-shadow. "All the same, we must remain vigilant. House Frey has many branches, and each might bear a different fruit. Some sour, some sweet. Roslin's father, Ryman, is as arrogant as any I've met. And Black Walder, let us not forget him, he scowls like a man with a dagger hidden in his boot. We must watch them." Robb nodded, acknowledging his mother's wisdom. "We will. But for now, the Freys remain valuable allies. Better that than leaving them resentful with their gates shut." As for Roslin's reaction to her family, she corresponded politely with her grandfather and uncles. She never quite lost that tremor of nerves whenever she read Walder Frey's letters. She never knew if a cutting remark or a sly demand would appear in the text. But she had grown more confident in Winterfell, comforted by the sense that she did indeed belong here, that her son Eddard and her husband cherished her. She loved the old god's quiet hush in the godswood, finding it a welcome contrast from her memories of the twins, where stone corridors echoed with suspicion. Autumn slid into a deeper chill. Night froze. STS spread across the courtyard, turning any lingering leaves brittle. Robb found himself in the company of roving lords who came to Winterfell in search of his favor or to petition for some boon. Lord Wyman Manderly sent a pair of envoys with their retinues, bringing tales of trade alliances with Bravos, the possibility of new shipments of iron and cloth. Torrens Square wrote of good harvests and readiness to supply more men if needed. But from the Drefort, news arrived in the cryptic tone that always seemed to accompany Roose Bolton. The letter was short, polite, and gave no real sense of the man's intentions. Roose Bolton was outwardly loyal, yet even Catelyn had never fully trusted him. He was cunning, quiet, and uncomfortably pragmatic. Still, he had shown no sign of hostility since the war's end. Amid these visits and letters, a raven arrived from Castle Black. Robb unrolled the parchment and read with increasing dread. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a man named Ser Dennis Mallister, elected after the death of the previous Lord Commander, wrote of dire events. The wildlings had mobilized under a king named Mance Rayder and attacked the wall. They were repelled only with great losses, and a fragment of them had scattered south, raiding and pillaging. Worse still were the rumors of unnatural forces in the far north, rumors that grew more credible with each passing month. The letter implored the king in the north to provide men, steel, and supplies to reinforce the wall. Robb set down the parchment and looked up at his council in the great hall where he'd summoned a handful of his most trusted advisors. The wind outside wailed against the shutters as though underscoring the urgency in the words he'd just read aloud. "The Night's Watch begs our aid," Robb said, scanning the faces of those around him. Great John Umber, tall and broad, stood with arms folded over his chest, a frown etched in his features. Lady Midge Mormont sat with her hands on her knees, eyes keen. Roose Bolton, pale and impassive, said nothing. Lord Galbar Glover and a few others waited to hear their king's next words. "They say the wildlings nearly breached the wall, that there are more out there scattered across the gift. And worse, talk of whites, White Walkers, the dead." A hush followed. Some in the hall shifted uneasily. They had all grown up hearing stories of the others of the long night, but those were only that, stories. Midge Mormont broke the silence. "I've seen strange things in my time, your grace. I will not dismiss the Watch's claims. If they've lost so many men, we must help. If the tales of the dead rising are true," she hesitated as if reluctant to voice it fully, "then we face a threat like none in living memory." Roose Bolton's voice was soft and measured. "We are rebuilding from war. The realm is fragile. Our supply lines are strained. Are we prepared for the cost of sending men to the wall? We would weaken ourselves here if trouble arises." Robb's gaze turned sharp. "There will be no realm to speak of if the wall fails. If half the stories are to be believed, an ancient darkness stirs in the north. My father always taught me that the Night's Watch is the shield that guards the realms of men. Now it seems they need us to guard them. The Great John grunted his approval. Aye, the king in the north speaks sense. Let's not leave our black brothers to face this alone. If we do, we might all regret it. Bolton inclined his head, though his expression gave little away. As you say, your grace. But let us do so wisely. A measured response, not an ill-considered charge. They debated into the night. Catelyn, though absent from this particular council, gave her support when Robb later recounted the letter to her. Ultimately, Robb decided that the North would send reinforcements, at least 500 soldiers, perhaps more. He instructed local lords to coordinate the raising of supplies, weapons, and warm clothing. The winter roads would be treacherous, but there was no other choice. If Mance Rayder's forces remained a threat, and if the rumors of something worse beyond the wall were true, then they needed every sturdy sword arm. The next challenge came from the crown. Another raven arrived from King's Landing, this time from one of the Tyrells who had assumed a key role in Tommen's Regency Council. The letter read politely, but it all but demanded that Robb reaffirm the North's place as part of the Seven Kingdoms, ignoring the 5-year window established after Tywin Lannister's defeat. The Tyrells, apparently, were attempting to gain leverage and re-centralize control. Robb read it with a clenched jaw. He could almost taste their arrogance in the way they wrote, as though they had already decided what was best for the North. They were offering trade concessions in exchange for mutual fealty, which was a gilded way of demanding that the North yield. A new war was the last thing Robb wanted, especially now with the threat from beyond the wall. He had to balance the North's independence with the necessity of avoiding open conflict with the South. The war had cost too many lives. He rubbed at the scar on his left forearm, a souvenir from the Battle of the Camps, and felt a stirring of old anger. But anger would not solve this. He wrote a measured reply, citing the armistice terms that had been agreed upon, that for 5 years, the North would remain self-governing and not subject to the Crown's taxes or direct authority, after which a great council would meet to decide the future. He politely refused to yield on that point. Then, to soften the blow, he offered to send trade envoys to Highgarden to discuss beneficial treaties. He signed as Robb Stark, king in the north, and sent the Raven south. The Tyrells might not be pleased, but let them stew on it. The real threat was not them, or so Robb believed. The real threat lay in the snows and the shadows beyond the wall. Days passed, then weeks, as the northern host was assembled for the journey to Castle Black. Robb delegated the command to Galbart Glover, a trusted man who had proven his loyalty many times over, with instructions to coordinate with the Night's Watch and offer them full support. Galbart gathered men from House Mormont, House Hornwood, House Serwyn, and others. Winter was settling in hard, and the trek would be dangerous. Some of the warriors grumbled at the assignment, complaining that they had finally returned home from war, only to be sent away again. But Robb addressed them personally before their departure in Winterfell's courtyard, telling them that this task was as vital as any they had undertaken in the battlefields of the South. The men stood in solemn ranks, steam rising from their mouths in the biting cold, and offered stiff salutes. Among them stood Jory Castle's younger cousin, a lad of 17, determined to honor the memory of Jory, who had died protecting Ned Stark in King's Landing. Robb placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Your cousin was a brave man. He'd be proud of you. Take care at the wall. The boy nodded, lips trembling partly from the cold, partly from emotion. When the host at last set forth up the King's Road, Grey Wind paced along the walls, watching the procession from behind the rebuilt ramparts. Though Grey Wind spent most nights in the godwood or padding after Robb, the direwolf remained wary of large gatherings of men. War had taught him that men and steel spelled danger. Roslyn, holding baby Eddard at one of the arrow slits, watched with parted lips as the lines of fur-clad soldiers, wagons, and horses stretched away into the winter gloom. She felt a pang of fear for them, recalling the stories she'd heard of the horrors beyond the wall. Robb placed an arm around her, careful not to jostle their infant. They go to do their duty, he said softly. If there are ghosts and worse things out there, well, I won't have the North unprepared. She sighed, eyes troubled. I wish we could seal ourselves behind Winterfell's walls until spring. It feels like we only just finished fighting one war. He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. I know, but we're Starks, love. We don't hide when winter comes. We endure. Word arrived some time later, carried by a Night's Watch courier who came on a tired horse, that Galbart Glover's forces had reached the wall, albeit with losses from harsh weather. Mance Rayder's main host had been shattered by the Watch and a band of men sworn to Stannis Baratheon, who, rumor said, had unexpectedly sailed north to claim the mantle of savior. The details were unclear. But the Watch was grateful for the reinforcements. Meanwhile, the stories of whites grew louder, the dead men with blue eyes that prowled at night. Robb read the courier's letter by the flickering light of a brazier, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. If the dead truly walked, then the war that had claimed so many lives in the south might seem trivial in comparison to what lay ahead. Yet for the north, day-to-day survival demanded immediate attention, not only vigilance against supernatural foes. The winter storms grew fiercer. Snowdrifts rose in the castle yard and people huddled close to hearths. The entire realm braced itself, for this winter was rumored to be a long and brutal one. Supply wagons from White Harbor became lifelines, carting salted fish and grain up the King's Road, though even these caravans arrived sporadically. Robb rationed what he could, prioritizing the small folk, knowing that a starving populace would cause uprisings and despair. Sansa tried to help her mother and the stewards in distributing resources, setting up a soup kitchen of sorts within one of the lesser halls of the castle. She remembered dark days in King's Landing when she had felt powerless and friendless. Now she found a sense of purpose in comforting others. She had grown taller, more poised, though her eyes carried a lingering sadness. She wore cloaks of northern gray now, not the southern pastel silks she had once fancied. Occasionally she would wander into the godwood alone, perhaps remembering the day her father was taken from her, or wishing for a glimpse of Arya. Arya remained missing. Despite all the ravens and searching parties sent out, no definitive trace of her had been found. The rumors were wild. Some claimed to have seen a short-haired girl in Bravos or in the Riverlands or heading north with a band of outlaws. None of it was concrete. Robb tried to contain his frustration. He had lost too many family members already. He held to a small flame of hope that she was still alive. One night, in the depths of winter, as icy winds rattled window shutters and swirling snow piled against the gates, Robb joined his mother, Catelyn, in the great hall. A roaring fire blazed in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the floor. They sat at the high table with some of Robb's bannermen, sipping hot mulled wine. Rosalind was upstairs, seeing to baby Eddard, who had taken ill with a minor fever, nothing too alarming but enough to keep her fretting by his cradle. The Great John was regaling the table with a half-drunken story of a bear fight he had once witnessed in the far north, when a messenger was admitted into the hall. The messenger, half-frozen, sank to his knees before Robb. "Your Grace," the man managed through chattering teeth, "I bring word from the south. Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, sends his respects and begs you make haste to Riverrun." "There's trouble?" Robb's gut clenched. "What trouble?" "The Tyrells," the messenger croaked. "A large force under Lord Randall Tarly has moved into the Riverlands. They claim they're there to ensure the crown's taxes are collected and the region remains under Tommen's rule. They're seizing harvest stores, Your Grace, and they've skirmished with some of Lord Edmure's men. Edmure's outmatched, and the Blackfish fears a larger conflict." The Great John cursed under his breath, and Catelyn's face went ashen. Robb set his cup down slowly. "I see. So the Tyrells have chosen to forcibly assert their will." He could taste the bitterness of betrayal. Though the Tyrells had danced around the matter in letters, he had hoped they wouldn't risk open conflict so soon. It was Bolton who spoke softly from where he stood near the table's edge. "This is precisely the tension we feared. They're using the cloak of royal authority to raid the Riverlands. If we allow them to continue, all our efforts at peace will be undone." Robb nodded grimly. "Yes. And with winter upon us, the Riverlands can't afford to lose its stores. People will starve." He closed his eyes briefly, thinking of Edmure, how valiantly he tried to manage the region after the wars. "We'll need to respond. Swiftly." But a voice of caution rose from Midge Mormont. "We're half a kingdom away and the roads are treacherous with ice and snow. Even if we muster men, it'll take time to march south. We can't fight winter as well as the Tyrell host. Lord Tarly's men are better provisioned coming from the Reach. This might be a disastrous campaign." Robb stood and paced behind the high table, frowning at the blazing fire in the hearth. "We must protect the Riverlands or we lose them. That's half my realm. The Tyrells think they can starve us out, come in with fresh supplies from Highgarden. If we let them run rampant, all we fought for is undone." Catelyn folded her hands around her goblet. "What if we send envoys again? Try to negotiate. Remind them of the 5-year arrangement. They've chosen swords instead of quills, Robb replied, anger simmering. But we can try one last time. Let them see we are not eager to shed blood. Still, we should also prepare a force. So it was decided. Ravens would fly to Randyll Tarly, demanding he cease his incursion into the Riverlands, warning that the king in the north would not stand idle. In parallel, Robb would begin to assemble a southern expedition. It would be smaller than his full might, for winter had decimated supply lines, but it had to be strong enough to face Tarly's men if negotiations failed. And so, in the darkest months of the year, Winterfell stirred to a new war footing. Armories were opened, Fletchers churned out arrows. The Greatjon and Roose Bolton agreed to lead battalions with instructions to bring as many mounted knights as feasible given the conditions, for speed would be critical if they were to reach Riverrun before the Tyrells did irreparable harm. Robb wrestled with the decision of whether to go himself. On the one hand, as king, he felt obliged to lead his men in defense of his realm. On the other, he worried about leaving Winterfell and his wife and child. The threat in the far north still loomed. A single raven might arrive at any moment bearing news that the wall had fallen. Where would the king in the north be then? If he were thousands of leagues away, how could he defend his homeland from the true terror that might spill south? He spoke with Catelyn late one evening as they walked the ramparts. The wind whipped their cloaks around them, and the sky glittered with stars through breaks in the clouds. "If I do not go," Robb said, leaning on the parapet, "I send the message that I am content to let the Riverlands fend for themselves." Catelyn's cloak was drawn tight around her. She peered across the snowy courtyard below, where torches flickered and men readied for departure. "That isn't the message you'll send, my son. You can command from here, if you choose, or you can go. Either way, your lords know you do not abandon them. But it's true that your personal presence at the head of the army carries weight. And it might rally the river lords to stand strong. They love you, Robb." He studied his mother's face. "I sense a caution in your words, mother. Do you think I shouldn't go?" She lowered her eyes. "I think you face a choice with no simple answer. Winterfell is your seat, and it's wise for a king to be near the heart of his power in dangerous times. And Rosalind, your child. If something ill befell you on that campaign, the realm would suffer more than you can guess. But if you remain here, the Tyrells may see it as weakness. They might press harder." Robb exhaled, breath turning to mist in the cold air. "I've spent enough time leading from behind in these negotiations. The Tyrells have forced our hand. I must go south, for I refuse to be the boy who let the Riverlands burn. The realm named me king in the north for a reason." Catelyn nodded slowly. "Then go with the men you trust most. Leave enough of a garrison here to defend Winterfell and keep the roads to the wall patrolled. I'll stay with Rosalind, with baby Eddard. We'll manage as best we can." So it was decided. Robb made his preparations swiftly. Rosalind accepted the news with a trembling look, though she kept her composure for his sake. "I'll wait for you," she said, voice unsteady. "Just come back to us." She clutched their infant in her arms, and the baby blinked up at Robb with wide eyes. Robb swallowed hard, pressing a gentle kiss to his son's forehead. He would not let them suffer, not again. He would see that the Tyrell aggression was halted and that the Riverlands endured. In the biting cold of a winter morning, Robb led a column of horsemen and foot soldiers out of Winterfell. The Greatjon carried his own banner, roaring encouragement to the men. Bolton led another contingent, silent as a funeral. The wind whipped at their cloaks and ruffled the sigils on their standards, the grey direwolf for the Starks, the flayed man for House Bolton, the roaring giant for House Umber. Ravens soared overhead, dark against the pale sky. Sansa stood on the ramparts beside Catelyn and Rosalind, watching the king's host wind its way through the gates. Snow crunched under hundreds of boots and iron horseshoes. The gates groaned open, and Robb Stark was gone, swallowed by swirling drifts of white. They pressed south, forging through the cold. The days were short and bleak, the nights frigid. Campfires offered meager warmth, but morale held, for they marched with purpose. Some men complained of frostbite in their toes, others coughed incessantly from the winter chill, yet they carried on. Whenever they passed a village, they found the folk scraping by. Robb made certain to leave them with a portion of supplies, unwilling to take from those who had so little, mindful that goodwill was a precious currency. At Moat Cailin, they picked up more men. Sturdy folk from the marshes, led by Howland Reed's children. They too pledged to stand with the king in the north, though they cautioned that crossing the neck in winter would be slow, the bogs half-frozen and treacherous. It took longer than Robb hoped, but eventually they descended into the Riverlands. Frost still coated the fields, But the climate grew slightly milder the farther south they traveled, with ice giving way to slush and muddy roads. Along the way, they found small hamlets that had been visited by soldiers wearing Tyrell livery. The peasants reported that the men had taken supplies and forced them to swear fealty to King Tommen. Robb's anger simmered. He thought of all the men and women in the Riverlands who had already endured war. Now they were forced to endure it again. If Randyll Tarly thought the North would stay idle, he would learn otherwise soon enough. Word reached Robb that the Tyrell host had seized Harrentown, the small settlement outside Harrenhal, and had begun fortifying the ruin itself, using it as a base to launch raids across the Red Fork. Harrenhal had long been promised to House Frey by Robb, though it remained a cursed place. At present, it became a symbol once more of conflict. Robb decided that Harrenhal might serve as the first battleground. A sense of weary resignation settled over him. He had taken Harrenhal once before, but that had been against the weakened Lannisters. Now he would face the discipline of the Tyrell army led by one of the fiercest generals in the realm. On a gray, misty morning, Robb's army encamped within sight of Harrenhal's melted towers. Ravens circled overhead, cawing like omens. The enormous fortress loomed, its black walls scorched by dragonfire centuries ago. Its size alone made it daunting. It could house thousands of men behind its walls. The Tyrell banner with the golden rose snapped in the wind above the gate, a brazen display of defiance. Robb gazed at it from a small rise on the outskirts of the fortress, arms crossed over his fur cloak. The Great John sat astride a warhorse at his side, eyes narrowing. "Cursed place, your grace," Great John muttered. "Never brought any man good luck. We took it before, but that was half luck and half the enemy's folly. Tarly's no fool." "No," Robb agreed, scanning the distant ramparts for any sign of movement. "He's a seasoned commander. He'll have archers, maybe scorpions on the walls. We'll lose too many men if we try a direct assault. We might need to lure him out." Roose Bolton's voice drifted from behind. "Or starve him out. Harrenhal's vast, and winter's sting will exhaust their stores quickly if they have a large garrison." His pale eyes flicked to Robb. "But that could take months." Robb's gloved fingers tightened around the pommel of his saddle. "Months we might not have. If Tarly is harrying the countryside, we need to stop him quickly." He frowned, recalling his old war councils. "We can try to blockade the roads. Harrenhal is easy to isolate if we control the Trident. Let's fortify near the major crossing to the south. Cut their supply lines. Then Tarly might be forced to sally forth if he wants to keep up his raids." Thus began another siege, one that reminded many men of the bleak days they had already endured. Robb established a line of camps around the fortress, placing watchtowers at key roads. The Tyrell men, well aware of these maneuvers, responded by sending out swift raiding parties to strike at Robb's perimeter. Some of those skirmishes turned bloody, with the Northmen struggling to adapt to the Tyrell cavalry's swift attacks. Winter had left the roads muddy, the fields slick, which hampered the heavier northern horses. Tarly's men, hailing from a more temperate climate, still found the footing treacherous, but they had scouted the region thoroughly. Days bled into weeks. No word arrived from Tarly accepting parley or negotiation. Robb sent heralds to the gates, offering terms: withdraw from the Riverlands, return to the Reach, and the North would continue to honor the existing truce with the Crown. The Tyrell commander answered with arrows fired near the herald's feet, a message clear enough: they would not yield. Perhaps Tarly believed that the North would eventually starve or freeze in this prolonged campaign. Or perhaps the Tyrells had an agreement with King's Landing that forced their hand. In either case, Harrenhal stood defiant. Edmure Tully arrived after some days, leading a smaller band of river knights who had evaded the Tyrell outriders. He embraced Robb with relief. "If you hadn't come, your grace, we'd be overrun. Tarly's men have been stripping the farms near the Blackwater. We can't feed our people like this." Robb offered Edmure a seat by his war map. "I'm sorry it's come to this. We'll do what we must to push them out. Perhaps if we can force a decisive engagement, Tarly will sue for peace." But Tarly did not appear eager for a pitched battle, preferring to let the Northmen waste themselves in a siege. The nights were long, filled with watchfires and the howling wind over Harrenhal's black ramparts. Snow flurries came and went, turning the fields around the fortress into a mire of slush and ice. Men huddled under tents, nursing chilblains, glancing warily at the distant silhouette of Harrenhal's towers. Rumors of ghosts haunted the ranks. Some said they heard wailing in the night, the voices of the thousands who had perished in that cursed place over centuries of bloodshed. Even so, a grim determination bound the Northmen. They had not marched all this way to turn tail. Robb's presence among them spurred them on. He would ride at dawn to inspect the pickets, greet the men with a nod or a word of thanks. On days when the sun broke through, he would gather his lords to plan the next move. Meanwhile, Tarly was content to remain within Harrenhal's walls, launching occasional raids just often enough to keep the Northmen off balance. Finally, a stroke of fortune came. Scouts returned breathless with news that a supply train of wagons flying Tyrell colors was making its way through the forests south of the Blackwater Rush, intending to resupply Tarly's garrison. The train was guarded, but perhaps not heavily enough to withstand a serious ambush. If Robb could capture or destroy those supplies, Tarly might be forced to sally out or starve. Without hesitation, Robb assembled a strike force led by the Great John, Lord Bolton, and a portion of Edmure's knights. They waited under cover of darkness at a narrow defile where the road curved between thick stands of oak and beech. Snow lay in patches, half-melted, revealing slick mud. Torchlight flickered along the road as the Tyrell supply convoy approached. Robb lay crouched among gnarled roots at the roadside, gray wind at his side, the direwolf's breath steaming. The Great John, hidden nearby, grinned fiercely. As the wagons rumbled closer, the Tyrell guards carried spears and crossbows, scanning the darkness. They must have expected danger, for they rode in formation. Yet the Northmen had chosen their ground well. With a shouted signal from Robb, the ambush began. Bolts whistled from the trees, finding Tyrell guards. Horses shrieked and stampeded as men leapt from hiding, swords flashing. The Great John's roar cut through the chaos. For the king in the north, the fighting was frenetic, lit by the shifting glow of torches and the sudden flames from an overturned lantern that ignited a wagon's tarp. Men slipped and slid in the muck, grappling for advantage. Gray wind sprang upon a man in Tyrell colors who had raised a crossbow at Robb, tearing into him before he could fire. Lord Bolton's men advanced with an eerie calm, methodically cutting down any who resisted. Edmure's knights joined the fray, their horses rearing as they clashed with the stunned Tyrell outriders. In a matter of minutes, the supply train was taken. Some Tyrell guards, seeing they were outmatched, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others fled into the woods only to be hunted down. In the flicker of burning wagons, Robb surveyed the spoils. Barrels of dried fruits, salted meat, and casks of ale, enough to sustain Harrenhal's garrison for at least a month, if not longer. The Great John hefted an axe and split open one of the casks, sniffing at the pungent salted fish within. Ha! That's a lot of dinners for Tarly's men wasted now. Robb ran a hand over his mouth, tension knotted in his shoulders. We'll take what we can use, destroy the rest. He turned to Edmure. Tarly will see the smoke from miles away. Now he knows we won't let him resupply so easily. Edmure, blood spattered on his tunic, nodded, eyes burning with a mix of anger and triumph. He'll have to act. They torched the remaining wagons and retreated quickly, though not before capturing half a dozen surviving Tyrell soldiers. The next morning, smoke still curled in the distance from the gutted convoy, a black plume against the sky. True to Edmure's prediction, Randyll Tarly emerged from Harrenhal that very day with a vanguard of knights, presumably to investigate or salvage whatever remained. Robb's scouts reported that Tarly's mood was furious and his men were on edge. This was the best chance to force a confrontation in open ground. Robb gathered his host. In the damp, cold morning, they formed lines on the rolling plains south of Harrenhal, a place where the ground was somewhat firmer despite patches of snow. Banners waved in the stiff breeze, the stark direwolf, the Tully trout, the umber giant, and the flayed man of Bolton. Trumpets blared, the sound echoing off the vast walls behind them. On the other side, the Tyrell standard, a golden rose on green, stood out among a sea of steel helms and lances. Randyll Tarly himself was visible at the forefront, clad in practical plate armor, his visage grim and uncompromising. Before the lines drew too close, heralds rode forth to inquire if Tarly wished to speak. He did not. The Tyrell horns sounded and the cavalry began to advance at a measured pace. And so another battle commenced, winter or not, war-weary or not. Men braced themselves for the crash of lance upon shield. Robb felt the old rush of adrenaline. His previous battles had taught him caution but also decisiveness. He stationed archers at the flanks, hidden behind ridges, to pepper the Tyrell cavalry. The Great John commanded the left, Edmure and the Tully Knights the right, while Bolton's men formed a tight core in the center. Robb himself waited with his guard, Grey Wind by his side, ready to exploit any breach. The Tyrell knights thundered forward, lances leveled. Arrows whistled, and horses screamed, some collapsing in the churned mud. The Tyrell line wavered, then reformed, colliding with Edmure's knights in a bone-shattering clash of steel. Men went down, grappling in the slop. Over the din, Robb raised his sword, signaled the Greatjon to charge from the left. The deep-voiced roar of Umber men reverberated across the field as they smashed into the flank of the Tyrell cavalry. Yet Tarly's discipline showed. He had held a second wave in reserve, and they surged forward now, locking the Greatjon's force in brutal melee. Bolton's men advanced with measured steps, their crossbowmen loosing bolts into any gaps they saw. For a time, the battlefield was chaos. A swirl of green and gray, men caked in mud, screaming horses, the ring of steel on steel. In the midst of it all, Grey Wind darted between the press, snapping at hamstrings, sowing terror among Tarly's ranks. Robb spurred his horse to find Tarly. He glimpsed the Tyrell commander in the distance, rallying his men with curt commands. Tarly's name was feared. He was said to be merciless, lethal in single combat. Robb angled his path through the melee, parrying a spear thrust, hacking down a knight who tried to bar his way. He could sense the tide of the battle teetering, uncertain. If Tarly fell, the Tyrell line might collapse. If Tarly prevailed, the Northmen might falter. He broke free of the knot of struggling men near the center, only to be met with a row of Tyrell spearmen advancing with locked shields. Grey Wind snarled, poised to leap, but Robb reined in his horse and wheeled around to search for a gap. He spotted the Greatjon's banner to the west, battered but still upright, leading a wedge that cut deep into the Tyrell flank. Encouraged, Robb spurred forward, calling to his guard. Bolton's men pressed in behind him, trying to open a path.